Morning, folks. Welcome to our daily devotional this morning. And today we are thinking again of the fourth commandment. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. Yesterday we saw that God created the Sabbath and established the principle of Sabbath observance at the very beginning of time. He created the world in 6 days. On the seventh day he rested. But the interesting thing is that in Genesis we read that he blessed the Sabbath day and he sanctified it. He set it apart as different from the other 6 days of the week. It's in a different category. That's what we were thinking about yesterday. The question that I want us to think about this morning is the fourth commandment still applicable today? Is it still morally binding for us to observe the principle of the Sabbath? Years ago in the church, almost every Christian would have said yes to that question. They would have agreed that we are duty bound before God to remember the Sabbath day and to observe the Sabbath day as a holy day, as a day set apart for God. Sadly, over the years, many Christians have changed their views on that. And many Christians today would say that there's no moral obligation with regards to the fourth commandment, that we don't have to observe the Sabbath any longer. I would suggest to you that that is wrong. And I would suggest that the Bible clearly teaches that it's wrong. The fourth commandment is part of what is called the moral law of God. It is part of the 10 commandments. If the fourth commandment is no longer relevant for Christians, if it is no longer morally binding upon Christians, and indeed not only Christians but upon the whole of humanity, then surely all the other commandments that are part of the same table of law are also no longer binding. In other words, you cannot take one commandment out of this table of law and say that's no longer relevant, and leave the others and say they are relevant. You cannot pick and choose. Either they are all applicable or none of them are applicable. Now, of course, none of us would dare to say that the first commandment or the second commandment or the third commandment is no longer binding. God expects us not to worship any other gods. God still requires us to worship him in the right way. God still will not count a person guiltless who takes his name in vain. The commandment, thou shalt not kill, is still relevant. Thou shalt not covet, and so on. Now, if these commandments are still binding upon the conscience of human beings today, as they are, then the fourth commandment, which is part of that moral law, which is part of a law that shows us the moral character of God, then the fourth commandment must also still be binding. And God expects us to observe the Sabbath day as being holy. Not only that, God gave the Sabbath command for the benefit of mankind. We need one day's rest in 7. We need a day apart from the other days of the week. A day when we can switch off from our responsibilities and tasks and jobs, and a day in which we can come together to worship God. We'll be looking at that in another study. Do we need it any less today than the generation before us or the generation before them or those who lived in the 1500s? Of course not. Life is hectic today. And because life always has been and always will be busy and demanding and stressful at times, God has graciously provided a day in the week when we can rest. So because the blessings associated with the Sabbath are still needed, and because the commandment relating to the Sabbath is still part of the whole moral law of God, this commandment is still applicable and still relevant. Do not let anyone tell you that we don't have to observe the Sabbath any longer. We do. Yes, the ways in which we observe it are different from the way in which Israel observed it in many respects, but the principle is still there, and the main ways of observance are still relevant. Don't forget, the Sabbath was made for man, for man's good, and as such, it is a blessing to us. I think it was A.W. Pink who came up with this little ditty, which I would encourage you to remember. A Sabbath well spent brings a week of content and health for the toils of tomorrow. But a Sabbath profaned, whatever may be gained, is a certain forerunner of sorrow. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. God willing, we'll return to look at another aspect of the Sabbath observance tomorrow. Have a good day, folks.